Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, friends. It's a great honor to open this conference and to welcome you all on behalf of the FRAME project to what is going to be an exciting day, our final conference. And this is, a very important event for us, being at the end of a 4-year project with so many people. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the setup of the FRAME project, about the results, the findings of the FRAME project, so that we can tap and feed into the discussions for later today. Let me start with saying a couple of things for those in the audience that are not entirely familiar with this FRAME project. FRAME is an acronym which stands for Fostering Human Rights Among European Policies. Don't ask us how we got that acronym. We don't remember. It's too long ago. It is a research project, of course, funded under the European Union's 7th Framework Program. It ran for 4 years, between May 2013 and the end of April 2017. And it was carried out by a consortium of 19 academic partners from Europe and the rest of the world. You see the map. I take it is not legible for you when you look at the slide, but you have it all in your conference booklet. So you can look indeed from which countries we have distinguished participants, 13 from within the European Union, 6 from outside the European Union. It was coordinated by our Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, which I have the honor, the duty, and the pleasure to direct. And during the life of the project, more than 100 junior and senior researchers have been involved. And let me use this opportunity to thank them all very, very warmly for their great work, the great work which they did individually, as teams, as part of work packages, clusters, all kinds of meetings, workshops, general assemblies, and so on. It has been really great, and I think the results are impressive. And we will discuss and present those results today. In fact, you may have noticed, those of you who have already walked around, today we basically hijacked this place, this beautiful Royal Academy, which if you enter the place and you go up the stairs, you will see the portrait of Maria Theresia, who was actually the one who founded the Academy, well known to some of our Austrian colleagues here in the room. And, this is a wonderful building with lots of history. I'm not going to tell it all, but there is one particular place on the first floor. You have had your welcome and coffee in the marble room, but there is on the other side of that floor, there is the Thronzaal, the actual auditory where the throne was, the throne that was destined to be the throne of the Dutch successor. But then something happened, what we call in international law, an act of secession. Belgium seceded from the Netherlands in 1830, and so the throne was vacant, and this building was destined for another, purpose. But in that Thronzaal, you will see basically a kind of marketplace where we put all of our FRAME reports, yes, all of them, where we also put a lot of posters, which will also be commented upon by the authors of the posters, where we have a number of very distinguished publishers with all of their great books, especially on human rights, where we also show you video clips of the MOOC, the massive open online course that we developed as part of this FRAME project. So I really encourage you to walk around as much as possible and to enjoy and interact, not just with what we are discussing in the panels and in the plenary sessions, but also in the Thronzaal. Now, I should also add, besides, when thanking people, we had the wonderful consortium, but we also had a very distinguished international advisory board, and I'm really grateful for the members of the advisory board for all of their very active inputs throughout the life of the project. I see here we have a number of distinguished members like Mrs. Véronique Arnaud, Jonas Grimheden, and so on. Very welcome also to our final conference. And last but not least, a very warm word of welcome to Mr. Yuri Borgman Prebel, who is our project officer at the European Commission. And I can really say, we've never had such a good project officer at the Commission. And those with some experience with European projects know what this actually means. Now, let me just quickly recap. We had a large project, 19 partners, 4 years. We had 4 main clusters of research. You have to organize your research. And, you know, people do that in work packages, as they call it. We had 14 work packages, but to organize everything well, we structured that around 4 clusters. And here again, this is much too small to read for you, but you find it in your conference booklet. There are 4 work packages, 4 clusters. The first one asks about the factors, and where we investigated which factors enabled or and hinder the protection of human rights by the European Union. All kinds of things. Structural factors, institutional problems, all kinds of things that positively or negatively affected the EU's human rights protection. That cluster was, in fact, the first one which ended its research. Then we looked in the second cluster to the actors, the question which actors the EU should engage with in its effort to promote and protect human rights. This is an enormous variety of actors. It goes from the member states of the EU, of course, the institutions and bodies and agencies of the EU, to everything that is out there, third countries, international organizations at the regional, interregional, global level, but also, of course, non-state actors, multinational enterprises, the perpetrators of crimes in third countries, I mean, the good, the bad, and so on. All the actors that you can imagine that have an impact upon the EU's engagement with regard to the promotion and the protection of human rights in the world. Third cluster, the impact of selected policies of the EU on human rights. Trade and development policies, what impact do they have on human rights? Area of freedom, security, and justice, migration, you know. We ran this project while the biggest migration and refugee crisis erupted. We didn't foresee that, but of course we adapted our research to take that all into account. Fight against terrorism, and so on. Also, the whole area of the toolkit of the EU, its democratization and human rights tools to foster these things in the wider world. All of these were basically looked at carefully in this third cluster. And then last but not least, the fourth cluster really looked more specifically at things such as benchmarks, human rights indicators. We were developing policy proposals, recommendations, and so on. And in fact, you have all received this beautiful bag. And I should say something about the content of the bag. You will have explored it yourself. I'm sure the first thing you have already seen and probably even consumed are the chocolates. There are some chocolates with even a frame logo in it. Because we are in Belgium, we thought that would maybe be a nice thing. But there are more important things in that bag than that. First of all, there is a conference booklet, fine. There is the outcome document, a small booklet in which we basically brought together the 40 final policy recommendations that we have produced under the FRAME project. I'm going to highlight some of these recommendations right now, but I want you to be aware you can read that during the day, and it's also meant for you to take a look and to engage in the further discussions at the panels and the plenary session later today. Since we never think it is enough, we produced yet another document for this conference, and this is what we call the FRAME Brussels Declaration. Yes, and so that's also in your materials. It's a bit on a stiffer piece of paper. For those who don't really like to read very, say, technically worded policy recommendations, I would say this is a little bit more open layman's language in which we really say, these are the main findings, these are our main messages to the European Union and its member states. Next to the chocolates and all those materials, there is also something like this, which basically is a USB stick with all of the 10,000 pages of research reports of the FRAME project. So you all get that, you all have it now. I mean, we couldn't think of a better way of disseminating this, so you have it. It's basically also online. The difference with the online version is that on the website, we have a very user-friendly search tool. So really, you have to try that. for instance, you Google your name, you put your name there, you see where you have been quoted or misquoted in the footnotes. You'll find a lot of things on that online research tool. But the USB stick, we thought, would also be very, very interesting for you. Okay, and that brings me to this output thing indeed, because we actually promised a lot to the European Commission. And to be honest, we delivered more than what we promised. In 4 years' time, we published 54 comprehensive research reports. And when I say research reports, this was not meant to be a minimalistic kind of couple of, A4s, short, summary, superficial. No, we have reports that are more than 350 pages. So, I mean, very, very thorough reports in which we really wanted to give the full comprehensive type of analysis and overview. 10,000 pages, as I said, of knowledge on the USB stick. And on the website, you find everything that you further need, including that very user-friendly tool, research tool. Now, we have also organized a great number of events. I've lost the counting. In fact, when you go to the Thronsaal, you will see there is a poster that tried to list up all the events that Frame organized and the partners of Frame during the lifetime. It's more than 100 events, workshops, conferences, seminars, meetings, roundtables with policymakers at the national, at the EU level, and so on. So we really had also a lot of what we call outreach, but it's more than outreach. It's really interactive. It's fed into our research as well. We organized a MOOC, a massive open online course on the EU and human rights. We were very, pleased to do that. We had 2 editions of that MOOC until now. There will be next ones in the future, so we don't give up on that. It's for free, and everybody in the world can participate and get a certificate at the end. I don't know what the labor market's value of that certificate is, but I do know that we had more than 12,000 participants from 175 countries. It was a very, very great success, and we really think this MOOC concept is something very interesting for the future, especially when you take a look from the viewpoint of countries in the South, which often don't have like the library or other resources to get into all these things. Now, everything is available online, but also this MOOC makes things accessible in a very, interactive manner, because there are interviews, we refer to reports, but there are a lot of say, interactive discussion, fora, and so on and so forth. So it was a great thing to do. We never promised to do that, but we simply did it because we liked the dynamics of the project, and we had so many wonderful experts that were able to, appear in the MOOC. I already mentioned the Brussels Declaration. Please take a look at it. It's small print, but it's meant to be fitting on 2 pages, and the outcome document. Let's go into the substance, if we may, the whole question of what we did and why we did it. Why a project on the EU and human rights in the first place? Actually, this was based upon a call under the 7th Framework Program, and as a consortium, we were tasked to verify the reality of what we came to call the EU's commitment to human rights, by which the European Union pledges to protect and promote human rights in basically everything that it does, in its internal policies, in its external policies. On the picture here, you of course recognize a number of dignitaries. You will see, of course, the High Representative / Vice President Federica Mogherini, the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, who will be with us for a keynote lecture tonight, and a number of ministers of foreign affairs, holding a sign that EU for human rights, a symbol of this commitment. I think the picture was taken at the time in June 2015 that the new action plan was adopted for human rights and democracy. What is this commitment like? Well, it's the result of a very long gestation process, a very long evolution, which started in a way long before the EU treaties made any reference to human rights, when the EU was actually not the EU, when the EU was still the European communities. And when there was nothing in the treaties, but where the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg started to incrementally make references to human rights as part of, remember, the general principles of community law. And that, of course, drew its inspiration from a number of sources because there was nothing in community law itself. So the court drew inspiration from what is called the common constitutional traditions of the member states and international human rights protection instruments, in particular the European Convention of Human Rights that you all know has its base in the Council of Europe with the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So the Court of Justice drew inspiration from that, and it's very interesting to see in the history of human rights in the EU how later on the constitutional legislature of the EU basically took that on board, codified it in what you nowadays find in Article 6, paragraph 3 of the Treaty on the European Union, basically saying that there is indeed the EU and human rights based upon those common constitutional traditions of the member states and the European Convention on Human Rights. But there is more than that. The Lisbon Treaty, the latest treaty change that is with us, that entered into force on the 1st of December 2009, the Lisbon Treaty makes multiple references to human rights. One of the first references you find in the magical Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union, which sums up the core values, the foundational values that the European Union subscribes to. Let me just quickly quote it because it's important also for the rest of our discussions today. The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. End of quote. So a very ambitious, foundational kind of article. I think that if ever we make something like a Pledge of Allegiance in our schools, we should learn our pupils to quote this article too in a certain way, because it really embodies all the values that we want to be there in our European society. Aspirational, but not just aspirational. This is also a matter of constitutional engagement and binding law, primary law of the European Union. Article 6 I already mentioned, but Article 6 is a very important article because it has three limbs. It refers also in the first section, first paragraph, to the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The European Union has its own human rights charter since 2000. It has been slightly revised in 2007, but the great thing of the Lisbon Treaty is that it made it binding as treaty law. So it is really binding upon the member states, and there is a lot of dynamics since 2009, also in the case law of the European Court of Justice, with regard to the interpretation of this EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. And the Charter is really a very important document, not just because it applies in all respects to everything that the EU and the member states, while implementing EU law, do, but also because, yeah, you have those. The Charter is a wonderful kind of summary or synthesis, if you wish, from all of the sources that we could draw inspiration from. The European Convention, constitutional traditions, but also the most state-of-the-art issues of human rights. It's actually the most up-to-date human rights document, I think, in the world. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I mean, it's something we should be proud of. It is binding upon us, and it should guide our policies. And that's now also something which, during the FRAME project, we could see coming to full fruition. The Charter had become binding law, and we could see how it affected and implicated on EU internal, but I should also add external policies. Something very important, which is sometimes forgotten, that is that the EU, being an organization and not a state, the EU does not have full plenary powers. It has only the powers that were conferred upon it by the member states, the conferral principle, and it doesn't have dedicated human rights powers. This is sometimes forgotten. The EU can only act where it has been given competences by its member states, and human rights is not a particular competence. You will not find it listed somewhere in Articles 3 to 6 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. No, it's a responsibility. And so it's very important to keep that in mind, to know that when the EU exercises certain powers, yes, it has to do that in a human rights consistent manner. It's a responsibility, but not a real kind of competence. So it's, if you wish, a normative horizon for the EU's actions. Good. We come to our findings of the FRAME project. After 4 years of meticulously surveying the EU's exercise of its competences and studying the impact of EU policies on human rights, we have come to the following overall conclusion. The commitment is taken seriously by the EU, we think, we find, and there is a sincere desire, in particular from staff working in all the institutions, agencies, bodies of the EU, to implement that commitment. But its rollout is threatened by a number of developments. So there are some dark clouds. Let me start with the positive things. We have noticed in the course of our project that the commitment of the EU to human rights was gaining speed, and that there was evidence of willingness to pursue it. Examples include the never-ending increasing references to the Charter of Human Rights in many EU documents, in the case law of the European Court of Justice. I refer to this great annual report that DG Justice of the European Commission makes on the application of the Charter, really worth reading. We always look forward to the new edition of that report. And there you really see how it has come to life, not just at the European level, but also at the national level, before member state courts and so on and so forth. But also the number of policy documents which expressly really seek to implement the EU's commitment to human rights are more and more there. Think in particular of the strategic framework and action plan on human rights and democracy, which has been with us since mid-2012. A new version, as I said, of the action plan was adopted in 2015. But these are really, very important documents that demonstrate the level of complexity and sophistication that the EU has reached in implementing its human rights commitment. Think of the 113 action points in the action plan. Quite considerable, quite important. There is another very important player here which I would like to highlight, and in fact there are distinguished representatives of it in the room. That's the Fundamental Rights Agency. The EU Fundamental Rights Agency, which celebrated its 10th anniversary in February of this year, is a highly respected EU agency. Is often, and I would say more and more, requested by the EU institutions to provide data and opinions on issues of fundamental rights. Think of the situation of Roma in the EU. And this is also notably thanks to its able directors. And we have the great honor here of having the first director of the agency delivering a keynote. We still wait for his arrival. I'm not sure if Morten Kjaerum has already arrived. We know his plane has landed. So in that sense, we are already very relieved that he's on Belgian soil. So he's on his way to us. Commission DGs are very active. Think of DG DEFCO also, contributing to best practices in development policies by progressively implementing a so-called human rights-based approach to development. And I mean, I cannot list all the agencies and actors, but it shows things are on the move. There are lots of very positive developments in EU practice, which bring us closer to realizing that human rights commitment. However, there are also adverse phenomena which prevent that commitment from taking root and from moving forward. And I would like to discuss two of those issues in more detail. Of course, our reports point to a much more comprehensive analysis of the negative factors. Remember, cluster 1. First of all, the human rights commitment of the EU is not yet sufficiently embedded in EU policy and lawmaking. We believe the EU could do more to ensure that really all of its policies protect and promote human rights. But there are many reasons why this is not yet the case. For instance, there is a knowledge gap. We found out in the many interviews that we did with EU officials that while they are, of course, committed as such to the cause, many of them, while being very competent, they don't necessarily all know everything about the implications of the human rights commitment for their daily activities. Very often it's a matter of knowledge, training, awareness, what have you. Second example are issues of coherence. All EU policies, have to be coherent. That's also what the treaty says, but they are not. They are not all coherent with human rights because there are a number of misalignments which play out against human rights. Some of those misalignments are institutional. Think, for instance, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. However active and proactive it can be in its case law, it doesn't have jurisdiction to rule on issues under the so-called common foreign and security policy. There its jurisdiction is mainly excluded. It can also be misalignments concerning policy regimes. If we studied the various internal and external policies of the European Union, we really saw that the approach to human rights is really very different according to the policy field. And sometimes, there are interests, plain interests that override human rights. It can have to do with migration control, it can have to do with security in the fight against terrorism, can have to do with fiscal discipline. Right? The austerity policies, we have done many case studies about them over the last couple of years. Hard to reconcile with a full pledge and commitment to human rights, in particular in the economic, social, and cultural sphere. There's yet another reason which threatens to the rollout of the EU's commitment to human rights, and that is actually the backlash, if I may use that word, the backlash in the EU and in the world against human rights. Within the Union, we see some kind of backsliding phenomenon. In some member states, a number of them are implementing what I would call illiberal reforms. In others, far-right parties are coming very close to winning elections. And so far, the EU's answer to those developments at the level of the member states has been fragmented. All institutions, in a way, proposing different tools and mechanisms. And not all of those mechanisms are very forceful. I sometimes think along the lines of plus est en vous for the institutions to tackle some of those internal challenges. Then there is outside the EU, the wider world, which has of course not stood still, and human rights are in danger. That's not our finding, that's a finding in the latest annual report of Amnesty International. Many countries in the world have seen violence, conflicts increasing, intensifying, or the consolidation or emergence of authoritarian regimes. So when you want to be the good force in the world as European Union, how do you cope with that? With an increasingly volatile, but also somewhat assertive, if not aggressive, rise of a number of powers that contest it. And that will, of course, also very happily point to some contradictions and weaknesses in our own human rights records. So the commitment is under pressure. Now let me dwell a little bit longer on 4 issue areas which in our view are crucial for the realization of the EU's human rights commitments, and which may be representative, I think, of the challenges faced by the EU in this regard. In fact, these 4 issue areas will be the topics of the 4 big panels after this morning's plenary session. And these panels, as you see from the program, they gather experts from FRAME, who will of course talk about the report and the research we did, the EU institutions and bodies and agencies, civil society, think tanks and academia. They are meant to discuss with you, to shed some light about how human rights are taken into account or not taken into account in practice. Migration. We all know how difficult the international context is and how the EU had to survey an upsurge in the number of migrants and asylum seekers, which has really put, to put it mildly, the EU's common migration and refugee policy to the test. Some would say to the brink of collapse, whatever. But I mean, it's been a very testing time, especially since 2015. FRAME research has evidenced that, well, if you look at what the EU has done in this field, also in response to the crisis, that the leitmotif there was rather the control of the fluxes than the full respect of the human rights of the migrants, be they in transit or within the territory of the EU, those applying for asylum. On the one hand, we have seen things such as the EU-Turkey statement, we cannot call it a treaty. We have a nice international law discussion about it. The EU-Turkey statement, by which basically Syrian asylum seekers are sent back to Turkey. They cannot guarantee in the present circumstances, in our assessment, in our reports, what we found, that the rights of these refugees will be respected. And then when asylum seekers reach the European shore, the Dublin system, as of yet, places a disproportionate responsibility on the countries at the external borders of the Union, which cannot cope with all the asylum requests in a manner that ensures human dignity and human rights of migrants. So we as Frame, we have looked into that, and we've come to the finding that, in our view, there is enough capacity in the EU to do more, to welcome those who need it and to respect their human rights. And that there is a real need for more solidarity. I quoted Article 2 of the EU Treaty. The word solidarity is there. It's in different places in the treaty, but we're very bad at implementing that. Austerity, fiscal discipline. We all know what happened, and that happened before Frame became a project. We had the 2007 financial crisis. We had afterwards the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone. You know, we had a full-fledged Eurozone crisis, you could say, together with the IMF, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and so on. All kinds of austerity plans were elaborated and imposed on a number of member states. Think of Ireland, think of Greece, by which they would receive loans in exchange for strict reforms, which have led to massive cuts in public spending, and in particular in social programs which benefited the most vulnerable in society. For instance, the elderly, who saw their pensions severely reduced. So, I mean, it's clear that those fiscal policies have a bearing on human rights and had major, even disastrous consequences for the enjoyment of social rights. We also know that the financial actors, the ones who more or less triggered the crisis, are still quite well off. I haven't seen too many of them being the subject of criminal sanctions and so on. So we wonder, what were the priorities of the European Union in coping with that? So we did quite a number of case studies also on that, and we would like to engage discussion with you in this panel on this fiscal and austerity measures. Then there is security, and of course, nowadays when we talk security, we think spontaneously about the fight against terrorism, and a number of strategies have been put in place by the EU and its member states in response to terrorist attacks, which have been with us for a number of decades and years also, but also especially in recent years, there's been this, intensification, if you wish, the fears of the population and so on. So security has gone up, and up. And so the EU is very active, of course, like the member states, in freezing the funds of terrorist suspects, terrorist financiers. Countering terrorism also implies collecting, storing, and exploiting a lot of data. And also the criminal arsenal against terrorists is being expanded to ensure that all activity which can aid or abet terrorism is being punished. This strategy, these actions also pose a number of human rights questions. Restrictive measures must comply with due process. Remember the Cadi saga before the European courts in Luxembourg. Data collection and retention must comply with the right to privacy and data protection as protected by the Charter. That's why I'm saying that the Charter is such an up-to-date document. It has really provisions about all those recent challenges. Efforts at criminalizing terrorism must not facilitate discrimination against particular shares of the population, which was also part of a serious debate on the recent counter-terrorism directive adopted last March. We will discuss this also this afternoon in the panel in question. And finally, let me say a few words about how the European Union projects its commitment to human rights in the world by using diplomatic tools and other kinds of leverage to promote human rights in its international relations in and with other countries and at international organizations. The EU has high aspirations. I haven't referred yet to Article 3, Paragraph 5 and Article 21 of the TEU, sorry for being so legalistic, but these are the places in the treaty which are extremely elaborated in terms of the EU's commitment, and I quote Article 21, to the universality and indivisibility of human rights, and the EU's commitment to go for that, to promote that in all of its policies, also in particular, all of the external policies. So whether it is CFSP, whether it is development aid, trade policy, humanitarian aid, in all of the policies, including the external dimensions of the internal policies, the EU has a treaty commitment to foster human rights. And we really looked at that in great detail, seeing also what the EU does. When the EU is seen as a major economic power, how is it using its economic clout? By applying so-called conditionality policies to trade preferences, development aid, and so on. The EU's potential there is really considerable. But again, we have to see this in the world context. There are other actors on the rise, and we see countries like China, Brazil, India, Russia, having different policies, different ways of engaging with countries in the South without conditionality, at least human rights conditionality, weakening the European Union's position on the international stage, within international organizations, in bilateral relations, and so on. So, I mean, this is something we really, I think, ought to discuss also in the fourth panel. I come to the recommendations, because that's again bringing us to this beautiful outcome document of the FRAME project, and I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Morten Kjaerum. Very relieved to see you with us, Morten. As you could see from the 4 examples that I listed, there is pressure, considerable pressure on the EU's commitment to human rights. And so that's why we distilled from the whole FRAME research output 40 policy recommendations specifically to correct some of the issues that I have been referring to, like the question of embeddedness, backlash, and so on. This is a collective effort, as everything in the FRAME project. So it's really supported by the entire project consortium. We have really compiled it from the various reports and discussed with all of our partners. And we just hope that the institutions and the member states will find these recommendations useful. I'm not going to go through the boring exercise of commenting everything. My time is up. But I'm going to show you the structure of the recommendations. And it's a bit in the analogy of a house. Yeah, the EU has had all kinds of analogies with a temple, think of the pillars and so on. This time we go for a house because we think that a house needs stable foundations. It needs also a very waterproof roof and all kinds of other things to stabilize and to basically consolidate the commitment to human rights. At the top, the roof of the house concerns coherence. And the related recommendations in the outcome document seek to ensure that the European Union addresses the misalignments in its institutional structures, normative regimes, and the conflicting interests, which I have evoked before. In the middle, you have the daily bread and butter operation of the EU, the internal policies on the one hand, the external policies. And our goal there is to point to changes, desired changes, which must be made so that all of these policies comply with the human rights commitment. And you will see indeed why this division, internal, external policies. Well, we have found out more than ever that these two sets of policies operate under different logics. Internal policies are compliance and remedies oriented. When you speak about fundamental rights, we even don't use the term human rights, we speak of fundamental rights. External policies of the EU are more oriented towards dialogue and promotion activities. And in fact, in our recommendations, we really, take the two sets of policies and we recommend for each of them the architecture of the policy, how the policy is made and implemented and what has to be done about it, but also specific issues, what the policies should contain. Finally, at the bottom of the house, the foundation, you have the question of knowledge, awareness, and competence of EU officials, and I would broaden that up, of member state officials. This is a condition for the commitment to actually be implemented, to happen. I was pointing to that knowledge gap before, and to remedy, we really suggest to have much more training, better training also of all officials at regular intervals, specifically with regard to human rights, and all the tools and devices that the EU has at its disposal, including indicators and impact assessments. So it's with pride, with pleasure, with sense of honor and relief that I present officially these recommendations to all of you, and in particular the EU representatives that are with us today. We will, of course, also send them to the highest authorities of the Union. We hope it will be a source of inspiration for the Union. And we're very much looking forward, because later today you will see we will have a statement by Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, the former president, the honorary president, I should say, of the European Council. It will be very interesting to hear his was 5 years president of the European Council. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Just a couple of things to conclude. In fact, I've dealt with this, so we can skip this. In the interest of time. I'm going to conclude my talk, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. But before I do that, there are some video messages. Yes, you know, modern technology. This hopefully will work, because we have actually 2 messages from very important officials who couldn't be with us physically today. And that is Ms. Vera Jourova, the EU Commissioner for Justice, Consumers and Gender Equality, and Professor Michael O'Flaherty, who is the current director of the Agency for Fundamental Rights. They have sent us short video messages, and I just hope it works.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank Frame for the work you do. Your research on the contribution of EU policies to promote human rights helps us to make sure that we respond in the right way to the concerns and fears of our citizens. Academics like you are well placed to look at fundamental rights issues with fresh eyes and identify new ways to read reality. That is why the EU places academic freedom at the core of our democratic values. Recent attacks on academic freedom reminds us that, again, our principles and fundamental rights are under threat. The EU has had to deal with multiple challenges of late, and fundamental rights are at the heart of the most pressing problems. I am deeply concerned by this, and I am committed to promote the European Union's model of openness and solidarity based on the rule of law.
Distinguished experts, dear friends and colleagues, I am very sorry and disappointed that I cannot be with you today to take part in these discussions with so many experts in the field of human rights. FRAME is an impressive project, and I congratulate the institutions, as well, of course, as the scholars who make possible the important publications, the conferences, and the events, many of which I had the honor of attending. FRAME testifies to the EU's commitment to human rights, since the project would not have been possible without the funding of the European Union. But that is not to say that the EU is always and everywhere a champion of human rights. In this year's Fundamental Rights Report, we at the agency look back over our 10 years of existence and what that decade has meant for human rights protection in the EU. And while the Union's human rights story does tell the development of an impressive architecture for the protection of rights, we also see persistent difficulties in mainstreaming those rights across all policy areas. Going forward, Europe faces major challenges in the years to come. Let me name just 3. First, continued migratory pressures will stress the need for a comprehensive long-term EU migration policy, and this will need to balance the legitimate regulation of migration flows with the legal and, quite frankly, the moral obligation of honouring the asylum needs of those in need of international protection. Second, legislation and policies to counter security threats will impose additional limitations on fundamental rights, and these must respect such principles as legality, necessity, and proportionality. Third, the unacceptable levels of inequality and the related incidents of poverty across our societies must be tackled. Now, these three challenges would be more than enough alone. However, we also have to realize that the overall context for the protection of human rights is changing in a negative manner. Above all, we see that the human rights framework itself is increasingly being called into question. This makes well-considered and powerful communication on human rights one of our greatest and most important challenges in Europe. We've got to do a much better job of demonstrating that human rights are about and for all people. Now, against this background, the contributions of the academic human rights community are more needed than ever. And the Fundamental Rights Agency is also conscious that we must all work together to ensure respect also for your human rights. Researchers and their institutions are a big part of civil society, and they are no less under threat, as we are witnessing today, regarding at least one major university institution in the European Union. Colleagues, in this climate, the framed findings could hardly be more relevant, and the Fundamental Rights Agency looks forward to seeing their impact for a strengthened protection of human rights within our European Union. I wish you an interesting and a fruitful conference.
Okay. Well done. It's now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Morten Kjaerum, who will give a keynote lecture on navigating human rights in an unknown world, a compass for the European Union. Everybody, of course, knows Morten Kjaerum, but let me just say briefly, he is director currently of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights since 2015. Prior to that, he was the first director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights from 2008 to 2015. He has also been, and currently is chair of the board of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. He has also been the founding director of yet another institute who was one of our main partners in the FRAME project, and that is the Danish Institute for Human Rights from 1991 to 2008, which he developed in 17 years from a small organization to a large internationally recognized institution. So, you did great things, you're still doing great things, you will continue to do great things, and we're very much looking forward, Morten, to what you will say will be navigating human rights in this unknown world and the compass that we're all looking for. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you for these nice words of welcome. One of the things that I really envy my great-grandchildren is the capacity to be beaming yourself around from spot to spot, so you don't have to be delayed in Copenhagen because of de-icing and taxi queues and other things. So sorry for being late. But congratulations, Jan, with fantastic work, marvelous work that you have carried out with the whole FRAME project. It is really amazing. And thanks a lot for the invitation to come here today. What I will talk about is something that occupies me a lot these days. And that is basically, what is the role for human rights in securing a future for our children and grandchildren? This is where we are. These are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves these moments. How do we navigate human rights in a world full of unknowns? The number of autonomous developments that are converging these days and years leave us in a way staggered and at sometimes, I would say, even paralyzed. Developments may be interconnected and they may not be interconnected. And really, it doesn't matter because it all comes together anyway these days and impacts the unknowns that we have ahead of us. Some may already be wondering, what on earth is that up there? Well, it's probably quite obvious, it's a metro card. But basically, my first question to you is what the Hasseris Street in the city of Aalborg in Denmark, you never heard about it, but what does that have in common with the Hessel line in Stockholm in Sweden, a metro line in Sweden? What do these two places have in common, a street and a metro line? Well, what they do share, they share the fact that it makes a tremendous difference whether you live in the one end of the street or the one end of the metro line or the other. Actually, it makes such a difference that if you live in the one end, you live 14 years longer than if you live and grew up in the other end of the street. Same street, same metro line, 14 years difference. These are two places in Europe in 2017. Two places where welfare has been developed quite considerably. Leave no one behind is the overall call from the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Hasseris and Hesselby, I think, to us illustrate very well that we still have a lot to do. Who are the people who statistically will live 14 years shorter than the street or metro line fellows? They're Danes or Swedes, mostly men, low education, poor salary, maybe unemployed, often single, weak social networks, etc. They feel left behind. They're frustrated with low self-esteem, and increasingly via social media platforms, they have channels for their anger. And I think that is very positive. Very positive that it's coming out, so maybe there's a chance that they're being heard. Being heard may serve them well, but it may also serve the rest of the society well. In the old days, when the miners went into the coal mines, they brought along cages with parakeets. If the parakeets started drowsing, it was high time to get out. It was a signal that the oxygen was getting low. What we may have heard from the Brexit referendum and the presidential election in the US, 21% for Marine Le Pen on last Sunday, and throughout Europe today, may be early warnings from important segments of the population. An early warning of something unknown. Jonathan Glover reminds us in his book, A Moral History of the 20th Century Humanity, that the unthinkable today is real and thinkable tomorrow. He writes, and I quote, "At the start of the 20th century, there was an optimism coming from the Enlightenment that the spread of a humane and scientific outlook would lead to the fading away not only of war, but also of other forms of cruelty and barbarism. They would fill the chamber of horrors in the museum of our primitive past. In light of these expectations, the century of Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, and Saddam Hussein was likely to be a surprise. Volcanoes thought to be extinct turned out not to be." What we witness the past 10-15 years is an increasing authoritarian trend globally that is rapidly accelerating, nurtured by populism from the right and the left. According to the Freedom House, Freedom in the World Index, 2016 was the 11th consecutive year of a global decline in freedom. A key element is the attack on democratic institutions and in particular the separation of powers, and in that, attacks on the courts. In Europe, Hungary took the lead, weakening the constitutional court by dismissing its judges, substituting them with supporters of the regime. Poland has followed. In many more countries, populist forces attack the courts for being non-democratic and non-accountable to the people through regular elections. This is a message that is easily picked up in popular circles. The hostile language against courts is accentuated when the discussion is about the regional or international courts. Most recently, we have again seen harsh critiques of the European Court of Human Rights, followed by political attempts to weaken its impact on human rights protection of some of the most vulnerable people in the European communities today. The same can be said about the International Criminal Court, and maybe to a lesser extent to the Court of Justice. Just for the sake of it, let's move to the US shortly. Most recently, we saw for the first time ever a no-show of the United States of America in an examination in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. As well as we all know, they consider to withdraw from the UN Human Rights Council. In the end, serious financial undermining of the key institutions may be the ultimate killer factor. We still have to see that with the state budgets coming out of Washington. Apart from the courts and the international system, it should be mentioned that the media freedom is scaled down. A fairly new trend is the attack on the academic institutions, most recently the attempted closure of the Central European University in Budapest. As is well known, the space for civil society has been shrinking and shrinking throughout the globe and also in Europe the past years. The authoritarian and populist forces work to erode the mechanisms stabilizing the democratic state and the bodies protecting human rights. What was built after the Second World War is now seriously threatened. The attack on the institutions is what makes this period particularly concerning. Human rights is always going up and down, and there are challenges, but this time it's the very institutions, it's the structures that are being attacked, and that is what makes it so particularly serious. The authoritarian backlash has not eased, but rather gained momentum over the past decade. It would be close to suicidal to try to give a full picture in half an hour or even in a full hour of why the democratic world currently is moving in this direction. The financial crisis, economic inequality, and certainly important drivers in the process. And some may even add the refugee crisis in 2014 and 15 that has contributed. I will touch these elements, but focus on other aspects. And then I promise you, I will also offer some sparkles of hope and also a bit of ideas of where we can move. Fear and angst play into this in many different ways. And here we have, first of all, to remind ourselves that fear in itself is real, and so are the causes. But we may not need to fear all the causes, and we may not need to fear it all that much. We have to recall that fear erodes life quality, and in the end, fear kills. The obvious elements when addressing fear are, of course, to look at what dominates the political discourse and the media headlines. And here the list, I think, is quite obvious: terrorism and crime. And at the top of the list is currently refugees and mass migration. These are all real issues, for sure. However, are they so substantial and profound to allow them to absorb the political and public discourse to the extent that they do throughout Europe? Crime is in most countries actually declining. So in this case, the attention only serves to add to the fear level. With regard to terrorism, the very aim of these heinous crimes, seen in Paris recently, in Stockholm, many other places throughout Europe, the very aim of it is to create fear, and it certainly works. Here there is a tremendous task for governments, media, all of us, to find solutions not to allow the fear to take over our lives. I'll not go deeper into this, but just mention that I think it is surprising how cases involving our Muslim citizens are capturing headlines, whereas arson attacks on camps for refugees followed by signs of swastika is called for boys' things, kids' affairs, or it's carried out by an unstable person. It's obvious to where the fear is directed. The same can be said on migration. Not that 1.2 million refugees arriving in Europe is not a considerable task, it definitely is. However, proportionally, we talk about 2 to 3 persons per 1,000 Europeans. 2 to 3 persons per 1,000. It should be manageable. It should be manageable if we work together, if we handle it in solidarity, and with mechanisms in place. It could be dealt with in a manner that would not inject fear and animosity in important segments of the population. No wonder, and I fully understand that people get scared when they see thousands of foreigners walking up European highways with the police just standing there watching. It could have been managed, but the political will was absent. And again, I have to point to Hungary as the front runner with the Islamophobic statements by Prime Minister Orban and the current asylum procedures that are far from any human rights standards. These issues are also issues where the human rights world would feel at home. Addressing racism and Islamophobia, the protection of refugees and fighting for fair trials also for terrorists, that's sort of our home turf. Professor Philip Alston said recently in a lecture, human rights are always on the wrong side. Of course, he didn't indicate that human rights should not address these issues, but rather that the current attacks on the human rights regime can be explained from this perspective. When human rights protect terrorists and constitute the last bulwark for extreme restrictions on migration policies, on refugee protection, human rights will eventually become the target, the conventions and the institutions. This is certainly true for the most recent attack on the European Court on Human Rights that is closely tied to its decisions on family reunification and expulsion of foreigners. In many instances in Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights are the last instruments protecting refugees and migrants in Europe today. There's another dimension to this, namely that the human rights world, together with others, are absent from some of the more profound and difficult topics and fear drivers. In short, when did the human rights world last address the issues of the people living on Hesselby line or Hasseries Street. If they had belonged to one or the other minority group, the human rights environment would have addressed their issues. Why have we ignored Article 21 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights mentioning social origin as one of the prohibited grounds of discrimination? We have probably dealt with all the other grounds, except from that one, the one relevant for our friends there. So what are the fear elements relevant for this group? Well, if we look at Maslow's needs pyramid, the answer is obvious, namely security, and in particular economic and job security. Now consider how many articles you probably have read, how many upbeat, excited articles you have read the last months about the driverless car or the fully automated shops. And these articles praising these new technological advances and how much we can save, how much more efficient the world will be when we can just enter a shop with an app and everything is catered for. We don't say goodbye when we leave because there's not one single human being in that shop. Great. It is only 1 in 100 of these articles that address the effects of all this on the millions of truck and taxi drivers in Europe and across the world, or the frontline personnel in the local supermarket, or the 55,000 frontline personnel in IKEA, coming from Sweden, that will be laid off with the next IKEA app. These people, they read the same articles as you and I do. And they reflect on their future. And they look for visions and ideas to what they shall do just a few years from now. And for very good reasons. A trip to Silicon Valley will convince even the greatest skeptic on this that the world is up for a major redo. The new technological platforms, new ways of transport, together with robotics and millions of things that are unknown to us today, but will be utterly familiar in a few years, are now converging with a hitherto unheard speed. This is not a gradual change. It's not a revolution. It is, in the words of Ulrich Beck, a metamorphosis. So far it has been the blue-collar workers that have been touched, but just last week 40 investment advisors were laid off from a large asset management company, and maybe 40 people out of 30,000. Why does that attract the headlines? Not necessary. Yes, it does, because they were replaced with computers that can do the work faster and better. Very soon it will dig deep into the academic middle class in Europe, and the first ones will be the economists, the lawyers, and the doctors. Robots with advanced algorithms will soon carry out a lot of that work of the middle class. Just to complete this picture, it must also be mentioned that many of the most vulnerable people in Europe and elsewhere live in places that are first hit by climate change. The droughts in Spain and Italy have caused severe hardship for many thousands of peasants and wine growers. What is their future? The same weather changes are also what lead to refugee movements today, and most likely even more dramatically in coming years. The convergence of technologies has to be linked to the acceleration of climate change, and in that light, the picture of metamorphosis makes a lot of sense. The forces are getting out of our hands, since this is not driven by a master plan or with the outset in a particular ideology. It is driven by millions of daily actions and side effects of these actions. Thus, what will come is unpredictable. Some of it may be good, some of it may be less good. We haven't got a clue. This is detected by all, and it injects a lot of fear. Due to its high complexity, the visions and discussions that could help us take charge of some of it, create new visions, look to a new world. What are we going to do? This is time and again hijacked by the cry that sounds across Europe today. Each time when we get close to the discussion, someone in the room will say, hey, there's a Muslim over there. And then we all jump on the Muslim or the migrant or one or the other minority which is at hand. And then we discuss that and we occupy all our attention on that. The fear is personalized in the other. Let me go back in history for a moment. And here Roosevelt, always come in handy, provides a good bridge to the glimmers of hope that I promised, and a bit of on the role that human rights can play. In 1941, he addressed the US Congress with his State of the Union speech, presenting a moral order based on 4 freedoms: freedom of expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The 4 freedom speech is famous due to its influence on history, of course, was the basis for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, adopted by the UN General Assembly. The sense of security is intimately tied, as underscored by Roosevelt, to freedom from fear and freedom from want. So Roosevelt saw very well what the West has so profoundly neglected ever since, that civil and political rights are interrelated and interconnected with economic, social, and cultural rights. This was underscored in the Universal Declaration, and as we all know, reaffirmed with the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993. So the paradox that we are currently in is that the challenges that confront us, be it climate change, the technological developments, cannot be addressed by any single state alone. Only through cooperation and solidarity is there a chance that humankind can regain a minimum of control. This is a paradox, since nationalism has become the dominant feature of our times. So what is needed is that key politicians keep their focus on the issues and do not let themselves be drawn into the easy populist, nationalistic hate discourses. There's a Muslim over there. Keep an eye on the ball. This is what we need to discuss. People are receptive to visions and ideas about a future that looks different, but they still do need to hear the visions. The drivers of globalization and the new technologies that are hyper-modern, in one sense, these big companies, the drivers, and then at the same time, they're utterly old-fashioned in another way. The old-fashioned part of these companies is their enormous greed for money and unwillingness to share. They have to embrace the modern world that they have a big share in creating and offer their creativity to all of us about what the chauffeur, the cashier, the lawyer shall do in the future. What is their take on this? Let's hear it. And when will they fully contribute economically to the collective? A lot of these companies have embraced in their modern self-perception, corporate social responsibility, and of course, human rights and business. But at the same time, they contribute in a considerable way to undermine human rights protection by avoiding tax. Tax payment has moved up on the human rights agenda alongside the fight against corruption. Where companies resist contributing or offer the minimum protection of workers, governance structures, be it in the EU, national, locally, need strength and encouragement to challenge them. Labor rights, other core rights, have been hard won and shall not be thrown out overnight by the introduction of a new app. That happened with Uber and partly with Airbnb. We saw recently how the economic liberal Danish government passed legislation that so far had the consequences that Uber closed their business in Denmark. Where is the European Union in all this? There's nothing modern in eroding the rights of people with 0-hour contracts and Uber systems. Where governments often are far away from the people on the Hasseris Street in Aalborg or the Hessel line in Stockholm, the local authorities are close. Local authorities throughout Europe are now reacting to some of the nationalistic and populistic political agendas. We have seen the city of Gdansk, just to mention one, going up against the Polish central government on the issues of refugee protection. Numerous cities are now declaring themselves human rights cities. It is an interesting and promising movement. In the human rights world for some time, one has looked to the private sector to be a moderating factor when governments became irresponsible. That is fine when it works. However, we cannot abandon democratic institutions altogether. And those, of course, the democratic institution structures we find at the local and regional level. In Sweden, the Association of Local and Regional Authorities in March this year adopted a human rights policy platform for Swedish cities and regions. To my knowledge, it's the first time it has happened in the world that a national authority vis-à-vis the municipalities and regions have adopted such a platform, human rights platform. This is now to be implemented on a voluntary basis throughout Sweden. The Raoul Wallenberg Institute has followed this and been involved in it from the very beginning. Does the human rights approach make a difference in a modern Northern European or European welfare state? One could ask. I asked myself that when we started on this journey. And I can tell you it's astonishing to witness the changes that a human rights-based hospital or human rights-based classroom can bring about with very small means, taking the outset in the right to health, the right to education. One of the reasons why the life expectancy is shorter for the people on Hässelby line is that there are tremendous barriers for many people, in particular men, in entering a hospital. In a human rights-based hospital that I visited recently, they took the outset in the people living in the neighborhood, in the district, and they made a very deep penetration of the local community to the most vulnerable. What they found was that 40% of the people they reached that way had the deadly lung disease KOL. That can be treated if it's done in time, but it's otherwise deadly. Direct outreach with a human rights based. In the words of Ulrich Beck, we are all globalized one way or another. We cannot escape it, but rather take up the challenge. That is what many cities are realizing, creating global networks of human rights cities, cities of equality or sustainability, environment, and in particular on climate. Hitherto, I think the best illustration of all this is the climate summit in Paris in 2015. Here cities together with the corporate sector managed to influence the outcome. Without the cities, the outcome would not have been as positive as it was. With more than half of the world population now living in cities, the cities are gaining self-confidence in the light of states not addressing the more systemic issues, not addressing the issues that are real for those people and many of us. Generally speaking, human rights in this case offers a normative framework for addressing issues at the very local level. Human rights contribute to create a coherent approach to issues that previously were dealt with in silos and in isolation. It helps the officials to focus, take the outset in the individuals. Here, of course, the most obvious is the work on the marginalized groups and minorities. The local communities have at their hands to engage citizens in the decisions about their life. I think this is essential. In a time of fear and insecurity, this is a very powerful instrument that should be used to re-engage people and offer them a sense of control and influence. We see a lot of highly interesting experiments on this across Europe today that should be developed much more. The slogan from the disability movement, "Nothing about us without us," should cut across all this. Human rights serve as a common framework for some of the global dialogues between cities. And here, of course, the Congress of the Regions in the Council of Europe, as well as the Committee of the Regions in the EU, play important roles. Both institutions need to be strengthened. They need to move closer into the decision-making. At the UN level, a city forum is needed, and avenues to the treaty body system should definitely be explored. The paradox is that what in this way globalization visibly contribute to the advancement at the very local. It all comes together, the local and the global. Finally, there's of course an urgent need to address what I've circled around, the freedom from want and freedom from fear. The human rights environment needs to engage stronger in the linkage between civil and political rights and economic social rights. It was always a mistake that the EU Fundamental Rights Agency did not get a mandate in its multi-annual framework to address economic, social, and cultural rights. It was also a mistake that the troikas developing austerity measures had no expertise in economic, social, and cultural rights. Having had a stronger focus on economic, social, cultural rights could have addressed some of the concerns regarding the people living in Hassery Street and Hesselby Line, and many other places throughout Europe. It could have addressed some of the consequences of globalization and neoliberalism that has led to this extreme economic inequality in all societies. In this way, human rights work may not always be on the wrong side. By addressing the very legitimate concerns of these groups, human rights may regain credibility in the eyes of those who feel that human rights is always about the other. To sum up, authoritarian trends and populism is gaining momentum, targeting key institutions and legal frameworks governing human rights, rule of law, and the separation of powers. Partly, the momentum builds on the immense sense of insecurity created by globalization, inequality, new technological advances, and climate change that all converge in this period of time. The convergence has the potential of a major transformation of the world if we continue along the current track. The unknown will hit us unprepared. As illustrated, there are a number of avenues that can be chosen to at least address some of the concerns and to be better equipped to meet the unknowns with a strong legal framework in place, as well as institutions that can act. So let's listen carefully to those that are left behind, and let it be an early warning call for all of us, like the parakeets in the coal mines. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much for what was a very inspiring speech, something that we really have to take home and think and reflect upon. I would ideally have organized a little Q&A at this stage of the program, but as you may have noticed, we are running a little bit behind the schedule. So if you bear with me, I would suggest that we take many of these very valuable points into our discussions in the next plenary and parallel panel sessions, and that we are now more or less approaching that sacrosanct moment of the coffee break. But let me say you a couple of things just about the structure of today. You will, of course, all have read the program. We now are going to split up. We will have twice 2 parallel sessions. After the coffee break, a first set of parallel sessions, and then after the lunch, a second set. Then after the second set of 2 parallel sessions, we will come back for a high-level plenary roundtable. And then we will have still interesting things, because we will have Count Herman van Rompuy making a statement for us, and the final keynote of Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, this EU Special Representative for Human Rights. Just one practical announcement. You have, I mean, everything has been taken care of, as you know, because there is also the map of the Academy in this booklet. But just for your information, one of the parallel sessions takes place here in the Albert II Auditory. The other one will take place in the Rubens Auditory, but the Rubens Auditory, you have to leave the building and you then go back inside on the other side. I cannot explain it well enough, but you will see it actually on the plan, and there are all kinds of indicators, so you cannot lose it. But you have to leave the building and then re-enter on the other side for the Rubens Auditory. So let's now enjoy a coffee break. And I would say let's reconvene sharply at 11:15 in the panel sessions. Thank you.